So I guess this will be going to talk about anti-Semitism in the New Testament and in Christianity, and I guess this is repairing damage, and basically fundamentalism and anti-Semitism. Now, I have to wind up addressing those two things. It's very strange. I was thinking about this a little bit, well, because idiots, Bible's anti-Semitic and blah blah blah. How? I mean, I could take Isaiah and say, look, or any of these prophets, right? I could take any of the 12 or Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, or Daniel and say, look, they're railing against the Jews. They're saying the Jews have killed their own kings. Gosh, Jeremiah is such an anti-Semite. No. Yeah, or that Elijah was an anti-Semite, right? Yeah, we get the term, uh, calling people uh, Pharisees, right, as hypocrites or as, I mean, basically a hypocrite with power who's very arrogant, right? That's, if you call somebody a Pharisee, that's what it means. Somebody who's very dismissive, but, and holier than thou, but very wicked on the other hand, and the things that they would condemn you for, they do themselves, right? Well, you get this from Matthew. And Matthew is an extremely Jewish gospel, and it's Jesus is talking to the Jews throughout all of it. So, first century, there's Jews, Samaritans, Greeks. This is just the Jews, these people living in and around Jerusalem, right? And then you have these powerful, almost, I don't want to say political parties because they're not that broad, but groups, basically. Groups that are in power, right? And they're almost like their own governing bodies. You have the Sadducees, the Pharisees. People say, oh, Sadducees, Pharisees, Zealots, and Essenes. No. Because Zealots they could have had, they weren't of any schools of thought, right? I mean, they could have, been of, oh, I'm a Zealot, and I think the Pharisees are right, or I think I'm a Zealot, and both of them have it wrong. Both the Pharisees and the Sadducees kind of have it wrong. Or, yeah, I'm more tilted towards the Sadducees, but not in league with them. Because they just wanted to run, they wanted the other Judas Maccabeus. They wanted to run the Romans out, kick them out. And there was even more fanatical form of zealot called the Sicarii. So it's not as if, oh yeah, Pharisee, Sadducee, zealot. Zealot is not that. Zealot is kind of like how there's Democrats and Republicans, and there's someone like me who's like, let's just, not necessarily for a political thing, but very pissed off at the government. Then you have the Essenes, who don't really get mentioned in the New Testament, but when we dug them up, they sound a lot like the New Testament. They very much sound like the New Testament. To the point when the Jews read them, they say this looks Christian. When the Christians read it, they say this looks Jewish. And they just said, we're just going to wait till the end of days. We're going out. Jerusalem's damned. We'll wait till the Messiah comes back, or till the Messiah comes. So they took off. So this is, when it's talking about the Pharisees, it's talking about the head guys, not what would develop into Rabbinic Judaism, and 600 years later everybody would identify with Pharisee. So when you see a Pharisee, I would say that the Jews are, when they hear anything anti-Semitic and talking against the Pharisees, they're being anachronistic. They're taking it out of context, right? Now, I don't doubt that some Christians could have said, "Oh, this is they claim to be of the Pharisees. Well, we're against the Pharisees. The Pharisees killed Jesus. They killed Jesus." Um, and I actually wouldn't argue that that's a bad line of reasoning. They have violent consequences, but yeah, essentially that's what happened. There was a group that said, you know what, it's this guy Jesus. The temple fell, and it was for these black people like that did all this black magic like Jesus, and we should have persecuted him and his followers even worse. And they said that for a while. So when the Christians gained power, uh, well, then they had conflicts with them because the Jews were always in power. People imagine the Jews as these stepped on little people who were nothing. They had huge kingdoms back then. Even when Christianity was legalized, the Christians still weren't as powerful as Jews. At 325, there was pretty much all of Arabia was split between Christian and Jew. Very strange. And then it even goes up to the time of the rise of Islam. So and by the time of the rise of Islam, you have a Jewish kingdom that's strong or as strong as Byzantium is the Byzantine Empire, called Khazaria, taking up a bigger landmass. That's it's not, the Jews don't really lose power until very recently, 1700s maybe. About 1492 is when they lose power. Is when everything kind of solidifies as Christian. That's very late for people. Won't be able to wrap their mind around this. I should probably do a series around this. But even in Andalusia, they were second in command, and throughout the Islamic Empire. So it's the Jews and the Muslims that teach their children how to read and write. It's the Jews. By their culture, they remain strong. The Jews would have been gone a long time ago. And they were to some degree respected by the Christians and the Muslims. I mean, the paganism was just slaughtered. I mean, there was no paganism left, but the Jews were allowed to survive. Very strange relationship the Jews have with the world throughout their whole existence. But that brings us to, well, do we rely on Matthew, and do we look anachronistically at everything through Matthew? No. Well, for one, we take it in context. How do we know to take it in context? There are 4 Gospels. There's Matthew, there's Mark, there's Luke, there's John. I usually place Matthew low man on the totem pole for trustworthiness and for even conveying the gospel. Can I rip it completely out? I've wanted to many times. I've wanted to just take a razor blade and boop, slice, take Matthew right out. It's got the Great Commission in there. It's got the Beatitudes. It's got the Magi with the star. It's got too many important things, so we need it. Now, what's the one thing that should tell you, oh, you know what, this isn't word for word totally exactly what happened, because we have 4 accounts, right? And they're not really relying on each other. 2 of them use Mark as a template, but they're not reading each other. They're not basing it off each other, and they've got these other traditions that they're pulling from. And you can see the commonality of the traditions that they're pulling from. This would get called Q. But we've got 4 different accounts that the very early church said we're going to use these. Now, you think they'd use 1? Marcion used 1, right? The early church said, no, we're going to use 4 of them. So you get the idea. That's why when people say 6,000-year-old Earth and this and that, you could tell by the early church didn't have this. They said this is the general idea. When they say, in Acts, it mentions a bunch of places, and when Paul, Paul's journey, and Paul in Galatians doesn't mention all those places. Maybe, well, do you think writing in a letter he's going to mention all those places? course Acts was written after him. They're two different accounts, right? Two people are giving different accounts. Paul, in the way he's telling it, and Acts, the Acts writer, the Luke Acts writer, who's telling it the way he's telling. Now, if the Luke Acts writer were just reading Paul's letters and saying he went here, 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 wouldn't he just? Why would he put in anything extra? Why would he leave anything out? Wouldn't he just follow that format? He's obviously not doing that. He's obviously talking about a guy very recently, a guy that's still alive, that's still in Rome, waiting to be, we don't know if Paul gets to Spain. I think he does. He may have come back later and got executed in Rome. I think he makes it to Spain, supposedly beheaded in Rome. Fine, he did. Okay. But this also tears at fundamentalism, because you're going to get different timelines and stuff like that between the four Gospels. Does that matter? Well, no. I'm going to make an argument that fundamentalists might make, and they don't understand the argument. If you witness an accident, four different witnesses, they're going to tell it differently, right? They're going to leave things out. They're going to get some stuff wrong. Oh, she screamed and then the car hit her, or the car hit her and then she screamed. That's a discrepancy. It seems like a discrepancy that would happen, right? Did the car hit her first and she screamed, or did she scream and then the car hit her? Either could have happened. Now, when this is an argument that gets made by scholars, critical scholars. Look, these are real events being described. When the fundamentalists take them, they say, "Oh no, see, she screamed, and she was screaming when the car hit her, and she was still screaming after the car hit her." So that's no. They mess it up. The fundamentalists are terrible for talking about historic Christianity. These are. How do you know that they're historic accounts? Because they don't all agree with each other, and they got their different agendas, and they try to portray Jesus as one has, the righteous King, Messiah. One has the Word of God. One puts emphasis on something that the other one is not really putting emphasis on, but they all have the same ideas of deity and everything like that. It's just who's conveying it, how they're trying to convey it, how familiar is their audience with Jesus or the lifestyle of first century Jews. When I say first half of the first century, I mean before AD 70. Mark is almost supposing that you know a lot about Jesus. You've heard him at least once. Here's the basic run-of-the-mill of where he went and what he did. And here's basically a passion narrative with an extended introduction. Immediately he went here, and immediately, and immediately, and immediately, and immediately, and immediately. Yeah, all you followers, a lot of you weren't at the crucifixion, so here's the story of the crucifixion. Here's basically an eyewitness account. And if that doesn't get until its finalized state, until about AD 65, parts of that come earlier. And Papias, who's one of the earliest church fathers, who we only have fragments of left. One of the fragments we know is his. Says, oh yeah, Peter helped write that. They got not write it, but from Peter's teaching, basically his talking and telling about this, is where the writer of Mark wrote this down. That seems to be the case. That sounds like it. Why? So this guy got it dead right about 50 years after this gospel was written, if that, probably less. He's talking about this less than that time. This elapsed. And it looks like that. And we get these different lineages for these different gospels. So taking it that it's all 100%, everything had to match each other and has to match up perfectly, is so disrespectful to it. It's read it as ancient history. And it's much more beautiful and more reliable than if you say everything has to match up perfectly. No, because if it's written by people who are observing events, those people are going to make mistakes, especially if they're remembering, especially if they're retelling it for a reason. for a motive, and they all are. So, all right, just want to say that.